Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. Now, this is the point in the podcast where I usually say the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Well, I'm going to propose an edit to that tagline, at least for this episode, because Good Faith is also a place where friends who don't necessarily follow Jesus still help the rest of us make sense of the world. I have actually quite a bit of listeners who fit that profile, and this episode in particular is illustrative of why these kinds of cross-faith relationships are so important, because one such friend for me is Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and the author of some very important books, including The Constitution of Knowledge, which I highly recommend to our audience. He describes himself, I've heard him say this, as an atheistic gay Jew, but I would describe him as my brilliant friend who helps me think more clearly about my faith and its place in the world. And his latest book is called Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And it's a wonderful illustration of precisely why those of us who follow Jesus need to have friends like Jonathan to help us understand our place in the world. Jonathan, I'm going to call you John. Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Curtis, I couldn't be more happy to be here, and I'm so grateful for the help and guidance and inspiration that you gave me in writing this book. I don't think it could have been the same book without you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I should say from the outset, I do appear in the book, and actually numerous friendships that you have with Christians appear in the book. And I want to get into the substance of your argument, which is really important, in a moment. But set the backdrop for why these friendships were so important in writing the book, because you actually open the book with a very touching story of one such friendship, and you close the book with a postscript of that friendship. Can you share that story? Because I think it helpfully sets the backdrop to what you're saying.
Well, yes, I've been on a journey with Christianity, and it has not been an untroubled journey. I was born in 1960, and early in grade school, I realized I was different. Of course, I was Jewish, but not a believer in God. Somehow that never made sense to me. And I knew that I was very strongly attracted to boys and men. And I felt myself to be an outsider. I could not literally turn on the car radio and spin the dial on a Sunday without hearing a preacher explain why homosexuals were a stench in God's nostrils. And I grew up thinking, with a lot of justification, that Christianity was bigoted, cruel, and hypocritical. And I brought that to college with me when I encountered freshman year roommate named Mark McIntosh, who was the first real Christian I encountered, in the sense that he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. And this book is an apology to Mark. Specifically, it's an apology for something that I call the stupidest, the dumbest thing I ever wrote. In 2003, I celebrated the rise of secularism. I said, this is a great thing. We're, moving past those dogmatic, divisive religious ideas and becoming a secular society. We'll be like Scandinavia, and we'll be more enlightened and less divided. And that is not how it worked out.
Well, take us through this. How did you come to realize actually Christianity has an important role to play for every American in this society, even if you are not a believer yourself? Articulate what's the connection, connect the dots for us.
Yeah, and that was such a transformation from where I started out decades ago. A lot of it, Curtis, is just empirical. We have seen just in the last 20 years or so, very, very recently, what amounts to a collapse of Christianity in the United States. Now, at the front end of that, in 2003, I saw that beginning, and I called it apatheism, people no longer caring about religion. And I said, well, that's fine. We don't really need religion anymore. We can be post-religious, and that will be better. And what happened then was just that I was literally empirically wrong. A lot of very bad things started happening. One of them was that as people left the Christian faith, they did not become enlightened secular liberals like Scandinavia. They drifted off into pseudo-religions. even the best of those, the most seemingly harmless of those, like, the wellness movement or Soul Cycle, or some of the customized pagan religions like Wicca or whatever, even if they are not actively harmful or antisocial, they don't have the wealth of teachings, the traditions, the transcendent worldview that can create an enveloping account of why we're here on the planet and pass that on to younger generations. They can't do the job, which is, it really gets to the core of my book, which is the implicit bargain that the founders made with faith, and especially with Christianity, which is, we can give you freedom of religion and a constitution, a process, but we can't give you the Republican virtues, they called it, that are necessary to sustain that constitution. Things like civility, being law-abiding, being educated about your obligations as a citizen, being truthful. They said that has to come from somewhere else. And to them, that was, of course, family and community, but very importantly, it was religion. And so Soul Cycle, Wicca don't do that. They don't socialize you into those norms. Even worse, they went to politics. Partisan politics became the source of meaning for millions and millions of Americans. They defined their identities as Republican or Democrat. They began to see every election as an apocalyptic battle between good and evil, with everything at stake. They invested their religion with politics. They invested their politics with religion. These things don't mix. And that's making the country ungovernable. So here I am, 2025, eating my words.
Well, one of the things I love about you, John, is your intellectual rigor and integrity that allows that. One way to describe that is somebody who eats their words. Another is somebody who learns and grows and gets wiser. And that's how I experience you. One of the really wise constructions you've had is sort of this description in your book between thin Christianity and thick Christianity and sharp Christianity. And just thick Christianity is what you're advocating for. But let's talk about these two other versions, which you've already essentially described, right? Thin Christianity is that Christianity that is more about lifestyle, perhaps, or it's customized to the individual preferences. It doesn't really have a very thick transformative impact. So it doesn't supply the virtues you're talking about. And then you have sharp Christianity, which is that politicized, hyper-aggressive, fear-based Christianity. So, I think we in this Good Faith podcast, we've made the case why sharp Christianity, that hyper-politicized, partisan-infused Christianity, is so damaging. But you've just talked about, no, just as damaging as this thin Christianity. And you've talked about how it doesn't supply the virtues. Can you expand a little more on that? Because I think that's really the surprising part of your book, is this insight as a non-Christian that thin Christianity isn't going to do the work it needs to do that our founders envisioned. Say more about how you're observing that even in current events today. Like, where do you see the absence of a thicker Christianity that informs the virtues necessary to democracy? How's that playing out in our current day politics?
Well, to really do the job the founders had in mind, Christianity, it needs to socialize people into those core virtues. And it also needs to be countercultural to some extent. It needs to be distinctive. It needs to point the way to the next world. It needs to point ourselves away from power, wealth, striving, and this world, and to higher things, which means it needs to have some foundations in the teachings of Jesus and in the gospel, and it needs to be culturally distinctive so that it means something to be a Christian. What happened in the latter half of the 20th century to the mainline churches, the ecumenical churches, this is all according to sociologists. It's not a major subject of my study, but they said that Christianity lost its cultural distinctiveness. The mainline churches kind of just became a consumer good. You'd shop around and you have a church and nominal, but it wasn't doing much for you and you weren't doing much for it. And it didn't have firm institutional boundaries and it wasn't firmly anchored in the gospel. And the problem with that is that people drifted away. If it's just a lifestyle choice, well, there's lots of competition for lifestyle choices. The mainline churches were collapsing, which they largely did. They've almost, not entirely, but they've largely ceased to become an important cultural force in America. And the evangelical churches were thriving. They were gaining adherents rapidly at that point because they were offering that sharper, more scripturally rooted kind of distinction from the larger culture. And then what happens in this century, just recently, is that the evangelical churches become what I call the sharp Christianity. That's a different form of secularization. The big story of all of this is secularization, which is importing secular values into the Christian world where they don't really belong. And in everyday life, the sharp church secularization takes the form of politics, of the culture wars, of parishioners coming to church, and so pastors say we get them for an hour or two if we're lucky, and cable news gets them for 12 hours, and they come to church and they want to fight the culture war. They say our country's in danger, we've got to take it back, and that is very different from what pastors want to preach. And so both of those instantiate, you ask how this affects everyday life. Neither of those is doing the job of helping keep people focused on the next world, the world to come, the doctrines of Jesus.
Jonathan, it's so helpful for me to be in this conversation, even in this particular moment, because in this particular political moment, I struggle with, and I think many people struggle with, a sense of hopelessness with when you see what is happening in the news with the Trump administration, with the broader world, the rise of authoritarianism, the trampling of rights, the trampling of the oppressed, including the refugee, the migrant, the vulnerable. And it can feel really hopeless, and you can feel paralyzed. You can want to check out. You want to give up. You want to excuse yourself from responsibility to the world. And, your point about how for Christianity to actually play its supportive role in the world, it has to remain, the word I'm going to use that I think captures what you're saying, is peculiar. Like, it needs to have a place in the world, but it needs to retain its peculiar shape, because if it just conforms to the world, then when the world goes bad, as it seems like it is, then Christianity has nothing different, nothing peculiar to stand up to it. And as I was preparing for this conversation, I was trying to think of what it illustrates for myself personally, what I think John is describing. And I realized that if you were to ask me now in this moment, when I read the headlines that I do, like, Curtis, what's your message of hope? I realize at the end of the day, it's not like, oh, I think this is all going to work out. I think it's not going to be so bad. I think eventually God is going to save us from pain and suffering. It's actually not that. The true message I would have to say is, because we as Christians believe there is coming a day when our true ruler, Jesus, returns and will clean up this mess, will punish the tyrants, will defend the weak. That's a worldview that we Christians inherited from you Jews. I mean, that there is a Messiah coming that will usher in the kingdom. Now, the difference, of course, is we believe that a foretaste of that has already happened in Jesus, that the life, death, and resurrection is a historical sort of validation that coming day really has already broken through and will finally come decisively. Now, as I say that, I realize as a former pastor, I've preached that in Christian congregations. And the more I say that, the more it actually can kind of sound a little thin. Like I'm just sort of reciting words, and the people in my congregation are kind of nodding kind of blankly along. I realize that as I'm saying that to you, the peculiarity of what I am saying like rings very true to me. I'm like, I believe this, but this must sound crazy to John. This must sound just very, very peculiar. And it's actually refreshing for me. It's like, yeah, I actually believe this. I know it's peculiar. I know this does not fit in, but I actually think this is a source of hope that we desperately need, certainly as Christians, and we need to be a hopeful presence. And so, I wanted to ask you, like, when you hear somebody like me describe this peculiar vision, I mean, I think you're more familiar and more comfortable with it, but like, what else going on in the rest of the, what is going on with your fellow atheistic friends when they hear Christians say peculiar things like this?
Well, one thing is I don't know that they hear that enough, because
Mm.
I spend a lot of pages in this book ragging on sharp Christianity, what I call the Church of Fear, what our friend Russell Moore calls the Church of Depravity, and what I think are the catastrophically misguided choices that white evangelical Protestants have made over the past 50 years. But there is also a chunk of this book that's addressed to people like me, who I think we secular liberals, that's small L liberals, not progressive left-wingers, but people who believe in, freedom and democracy and all of that. I think we have neglected the health of religion. We forgot what the founders told us, which is that the country and the Constitution cannot survive without a bedrock of values that have to come from outside the Constitution. We took Christianity for granted, or even welcomed its decline. And you mentioned the peculiarity of your views. And I have to say, to me, they sound peculiar. I don't think those things that you expect to happen will ever happen. And I don't believe in miracles. I'm a scientific materialist, which is a thin, unsatisfying worldview, but I'm stuck with it. We haven't shown enough curiosity about faith. We haven't asked ourselves, what can we learn from this? How can we cherish it and welcome it? So Christianity it's a load-bearing wall in our democracy, and it's caving in, and it's causing all kinds of ancillary problems. So kind of my answer to your question is no, I don't understand what you're saying. And yes, I think it's weird. And for both of those reasons, I think we need to hear more of it.
You mentioned you have this lovely phrase to describe what we need, which is that we need this load-bearing wall that Christianity is meant to be. And with that image is a sense of, as it crumbles, other things will start crumbling along with it, including other institutions, and also kind of the framework that supports the house, which is frankly a lot of rights, a lot of privileges and rights and norms that support our common life together. Can you illustrate more how this works in practice? Like, as Christianity crumbles, what are the kind of rights or norms that start crumbling that actually affects us all?
This goes right to the core of what this book is arguing, and why I hope secular people and Christians will get something out of it. And there's two levels to answer that question about the load-bearing wall. The first is sociology and political science. And we are seeing a crisis of governability throughout the Western, quote unquote, developed world. All over Europe, we're seeing the rise of the AfD in Germany, and the far right in many places. Looks like Le Pen may be the next president of France. And it looks like three things are behind that. And one is social media, the fragmenting of reality, fake news, and all of that. The second is a global migration crisis, which none of these governments have figured out how to deal with. And the third, I think, is the collapse of religion as a kind of bulwark, answering questions for people on why they're here. What's the difference between right and wrong? And people will say, well, look at Scandinavia. It's not that religious, yet it's peaceful and prosperous. But you're seeing the same trends there as everywhere else. So at that level of sociology, that's what that crumbling wall means. It's making it harder for us to sustain our liberal democratic institutions. Then, more important, there's the level of theology. And this is where I hope what I have to say in the book is actually a new contribution. So we talked about Christianity's peculiarity. So let's talk about a way in which it's not peculiar. And that's that its theology is, I think, strongly supportive of the core values of liberal democracy.
Yeah.
And they are, so to put that in a nutshell, Jesus Christ is much more like Madison than like MAGA. But specifically, that means three things. Christians tell me that if you had to summarize your faith standing on one leg in three phrases, it would be: number one, Forgive each other. Number 2, be like Jesus. And number 3, don't be afraid. And you're nodding, so I'm guessing you're not going to disagree with that. Some people say, well, you have to throw repentance in there, you have to throw redemption in there. But those are kind of the big 3, right?
You're directionally correct, yes.
I'm directionally correct. I'll settle for that. So historically speaking, those things are radical, transformative, and very peculiar. Jesus is like no thinker who preceded him and no thinker who came after him. But directionally, they map very well onto the Republican virtues that our founders said the country needs. Don't be afraid maps onto, you're going to lose elections, don't panic. It's not the end of the world. Right. Keep going. You might even learn something and improve as a result. Be like Jesus translates into all men are created equal, including the smallest and the lowest, and a society is judged by how it protects the least of these. That's core liberal doctrine. And human beings are always ends in themselves. They're never means to end. That's core Jesus, and that's core liberal democracy. And then forgive each other. That translates into forbearance. Sometimes you win elections, but the point of politics and winning is not to crush the other side. Yeah. The point is to remember that they are still citizens. You're going to be sharing the country with them. Treat them the way you will want to be treated by them when the wheel turns and they're in charge. And so I'm looking at the teachings of Jesus as Christianity, as I understand them, and I'm looking at the teachings of James Madison, and I'm saying Christianity, the faith Christianity, not just because it's a faith or because it's a religion or because people need God in their lives. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the peculiar doctrines of Christianity are what our country needs to heal right now. And if Christians foregrounded those elements of their Christianity and put them into practice instead of the church of fear, our whole country would be better off. And you know what, Curtis? Maybe your church would be too.
I was trying to think about this for my own life, Jonathan, about your argument for this. And I was realizing that my own life plays out your thesis here. So my parents were born in China. So if they had stayed in China and they were there now, and I grew up there, I would be growing up in a communist China, an authoritarian regime where the church exists and the church even is growing, but it's very hard. You talked, it's a church under persecution that has to struggle very hard to find a way to communicate its message. There's a good chance that if I grew up in China, would never have heard anything about Jesus. And I did so because my parents eventually found their way to America. And in 1976, a pastor went door to door, inviting families who had an Asian-sounding last name in the phone book to this thing called Vacation Bible School. And as an 8-year-old, I went. I heard about Jesus. It made sense. I somehow got the gift that John, you didn't get. It made sense to me as an 8-year-old. And that was when I started following Jesus. Now, you break all that story down and you realize that story doesn't happen without the freedom of a religion. That pastor needed to be able to feel confident that he could actually practice his faith and then actually communicate his faith. So he needed the freedom of speech. And then they needed to invite me to this thing called the Vacation Bible School, which rests on the freedom of association, right? So just in my story alone, you see a living illustration of all of these freedoms, all of these rights enshrined in the Constitution that are a reflection of our founders' understanding, like we need this thing. We need this thing to thrive, and we need to create rights. And they're very congruent, both like you said, with how a democracy needs for all sorts of causes, whether it's not Christianity, it needs its own version of belief in those causes, the ability to associate around that, ability to speak and communicate about that. And that's crucial for all of us. But I think it's so helpful to hear you make a case for this as an outsider, but I think it really behooves, and I think this is really the prophetic call of your book, like insiders to the faith, Christians like me, we have to make the case. We have to articulate to our people, look, our very, sort of experience as Christians, our mission as Christians relies on this framework. Like if we're evangelicals, it means we believe in evangelism. We believe we have some news to share. And that requires all of these freedoms of speech, religion, association, and so forth. And we've just not made that case internally. And in fact, we've sort of gone along with, well, if those rights can be denied to those who are different than us, then that's awesome. As long as it kind of swings our way. Jonathan, speak to that sort of really thin false belief. It almost shouldn't have to be refuted, but I want you to do so anyways.
I give speeches around the country to colleges, and the name of my speech is Why Free Speech is the Only Safe Space for Minorities. Because on the left part of the spectrum, which we haven't talked about yet, there is a notion that's arisen that free speech is a form of oppression, that it's a tool that's used by dominant groups in society to marginalize people who are oppressed. And that nothing could be further from the truth. If you think of the civil rights movement of African Americans, the women's suffrage and equality movements, the gay marriage movement, of which I was very much a participant, it's all depended on freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Yeah. I mean, you don't need reminding of this, but the civil rights movement was inspired by, and was staged from the African American Christian church.
Yeah, that's right.
And took the shape it did because of Christian teaching. So yeah, these things are intimately related. And it is not a coincidence that the First Amendment is first, and that it enshrines both freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They are coexistent and coterminous and essential. Does that address the question?
It totally does. And I think so then, if we all have a vested interest in repairing Christianity's function as a load-bearing wall for democracy, what do you envision that looks like? How, I mean, it almost seems like you're standing on top of this crumbling wall saying, hey, those of you on the faith side, come and please repair this wall. Those of you on the secular side, please, do you realize this wall is really important?
Boy, you put that well. That's the whole book. That's the whole book right there. There are Christians right now who perceive that the church has taken a wrong turn in the direction of adopting politics as its creed, and who are saying, well, there's a big gap here. And that gap is that we've been pretty good, maybe not ideal, but pretty good at discipling Christians in their personal lives and maybe their community, family, church lives. You know, when the hurricane comes, the churches are great in a lot of communities. But if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that the Christianity it's not meant to be just cabined off to one part of your life. It's meant to be a seamless, unified garment that applies to all of life, yet it has not answered the theological question of, so how does Jesus want us as Christians to behave in our civic lives, in our interactions, especially on social media and in the political realm? And this is not a question about what positions does Jesus want us to take. Not at all. It's about how we approach our fellow citizens. Do we do that in a Christ-like tone and manner, in a way that shows some humility, some forbearance and forgiveness? And you're quoted in the book talking about a kind of theology of cherishing our institutions. And that's a step in that direction. And maybe more important, I think the after party, you tell me, but it seems to me an effort to disciple people in how to approach each other in the civic realm, not with politics in mind. I attended a session. There's nothing about Republicans or Democrats or elections. There's none of that. But it is about how do we relearn to engage each other, engage the stranger in a way that is fruitful and shows the fruits of the Spirit.
John, when we think about this, what will each side need to, by side, I mean the
secular
and Christian side and the secular side, right? Who both, together are like, yeah, okay, we get it. We need together from the other sides of the wall. We need to rebuild, restore this load-bearing wall. What are both sides going to really need to remember about the other that you think is critical to this partnership going forward?
To remember about the other.
Yeah, what is it easy for us to forget is true?
Boy, that's such a good question. And Curtis, no one has ever asked it quite that way. And it's super important. So I don't want to mess this up too badly. I am going to say that on the secular side, there's a bunch of things to remember, but something that I have tried to emphasize that I think a lot of secular people either never understood or forget is that faith, Christianity, but all of the great religions, they're not just like vehicles for other things. They're not just like vessels into which people pour their politics or their demographics or their economics or their sociology that can be explained that way. Theology matters. You have to look at the actual teachings of these faiths. You have to engage with them. You have to try, at least to some extent, to understand them. And that's the journey I've been on, seeing Christianity not as kind of a cover story for bigoted people who want to oppress homosexuals, and not looking at it as a kind of idealized version of itself either, but instead looking through it to the Gospels and saying, wait a minute, there's something here that whether you're secular or Christian is special and true. I don't believe that Jesus Christ died and came back to light, but I do believe that those principles we talked about earlier are central to Christianity and that I have something to learn from them. So I am going to say that secular people need to understand that doctrine matters. Wow. Not just the fact that people are religious, but we got to look at their beliefs and understand that and their implications. So what does the Christian side need to know about the secular side? I guess I would say that they should have, like all Americans, a deeper understanding of the importance of compromise as the core idea of our Constitution and our political system. That James Madison's breakthrough idea that defines our republic to this day is that you divide power between different factions, different faiths, different branches of government, different levels of government. And then you tell everyone, okay, you guys have to share the country to get anything done. You're going to have to make compromises. And Madison is a genius because he understands that compromise does not mean giving up your principles in order to do something halfway that nobody likes. That's not it at all. Yeah. Compromise is a creative, dynamic, generative process by which people come together to look for creative solutions to problems. And they think, I have one view, Curtis has another. We enter that room, we hit a deadlock, and then maybe I say, well, let's bring in Russell. Maybe Russell can bring in additional resources. Let's think about this a different way. This forces us out of our own little boxes to a level of creative engagement. It expands the available space for solutions. And Madison understands that. He says, once you force the factions to go through this process, we will get better results than if you just go in thinking, I have to win, 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 or at best, I'm going to walk away half unhappy. I think a lot of the fear that we see from both Christians and non-Christians, but okay, I'll say it, especially Christians, is this is a process in which we lose and the other side always wins. And that's just not the case.
I love that. I think that is so crucial because we as Christians, especially evangelicals, are wired to think compromise is a dirty word because we think we are compromising our faith. But what you're saying is, no. We're talking about a compromise of how we participate in the greater society. We can show up not compromising the peculiarities of our faith, not watering it down at all, bringing it to the table. But we have to realize other people are doing the same. They are bringing their own non-compromised, non-watered down peculiarities, and the richness, the beauty of the American Republican experiment is the belief that actually everybody is enriched by bringing all that to the table. And as we have all Christians, we should really subscribe to that because, again, we believe in evangelism. We're evangelicals. You can't evangelize if you can't not show up at a table where others are absent, where the others have been excluded, where others don't feel like they can show up who they are. And so we should have a vested interest in that table. We're switching metaphors here, but that table, right, that where everybody has a seat, everybody's seat is secure, everybody can show up who they are. It's not, and nobody's compromising their own beliefs, but they are going to have to compromise in order for us all to have a seat at that table. And that is, I think, the table that Jesus wants us to actually participate in, to have full human membership in. The book is filled with a lot of, I think, very penetrating insights about, at the high level, Christianity's important relationship with democracy. What I loved reading the book, though, was realizing that the author was not talking about this just as an abstract scholar in an ivy tower. John has lived this, and I know he's lived this because he really brought into being a group of very diverse thinkers, very diverse leaders, some Christians, some Mormons, Jews, atheists. It meets together every Thursday online. I've had the privilege of being invited to be part of it. And it is a living expression of everything we've just talked about. Everybody is showing up who they are. The peculiarity of everyone's beliefs is on full display. We all have a seat at the table. We all feel secure. And out of that comes, for myself, genuine understanding. My own beliefs are forced to be articulated in all of its peculiarity. And I realize, wait, no, I didn't quite get that right. Or wait, how does that sound to you? And there's conversation, feedback. It's an incredibly enriching experience. And it gives me hope that the theory of this kind of pluralistic society that really was our founder's vision is really the good. It is a good thing, and it is possible. John, I wanted to ask you, tell me more your experience of that group that you really helped bring. Why did you start it or help start it in the first place? And then how have you seen that evolve? What lessons are you taking from it?
Well, it started organically, which is how so many good things do. We had COVID, and a small group of people, I think me and a couple of Christian friends, just said, let's started talking on Zoom, like 2 or 3 people just to keep our sanity. And then we said, how about inviting this person? And how about inviting that person? And it kind of grew organically into this group of people. There's no rules. We just put out the lawn chairs every week, and some people show up. And sometimes we're even graced with Curtis Chang. I'm tempted now that we're on the air to nag you to come even more often.
It's only a matter of schedule, not a matter of desire. Yeah.
But so it just kind of grew up, like an untended lot in the center city where flowers just start growing. It's kind of like that.
How do you think we can create more such spaces? Precisely because I think, like you said, there is an organic relational friendship quality to this. I mean, these are some people who are, I'm not going to mention who are the members, but there's some very accomplished, busy people. And yet we all show up when we can because of, I think, yes, the fruit of it, but I think really the friendship, the relational aspect is the real secret sauce.
It's relational, but it's also substantive. To me, part of the secret sauce is these are people who are not afraid to raise and grapple with hard questions and even sometimes risk offending each other. There's enough trust to do that. And they are willing to really try to put some protein in the conversation. And to me, that's a lot of the magic, that it takes some trust to do that. And one member of the group that I know I can out is Tim Keller, because he's no longer with us. Yeah. But Tim was, for those who know him, he was one of the great American pastors of his era. I think he died, a couple of years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
But he brought this spirit that helped me understand Christianity better, because he was so faithful and yet so intellectual and so honest. He gave me the insight. We talked about the problem of why God allows evil and suffering in the world. And Christians have a lot to say about that. None of it very convincing in my viewpoint. And when we talked
Sometimes it's
about
not
it,
very convincing to me, John, also, just so you know.
yeah, the free will thing, that doesn't get you there. But Tim said that in his life as a pastor and theologian, that when he took everything that he could gather to explain that problem from a Christian point of view and put it all in one place in a bucket, that where the top of the bucket would be explaining the problem, solving the problem, that he had never gotten the bucket more than maybe on a good day 3/4 full. Did you ever hear him say that?
I have heard him say that, yeah.
And to me, that had the ring of honesty about it, of soul-searching honesty. Something I think I've learned is that for at least the type of Christian that I've come to know and admire, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt is part of faith. I don't really understand how you guys do that, and I think that is a gift.
Any final words to the Christians, and the majority of our listeners, I think, probably are Christians. Not probably, that we know they are, but you've got full access to this audience of thoughtful Christians who want to have a healthy, good place in the world. That's why we're called the Good Faith. We want to show up as good news in the world. Do you have any final words for this audience?
My final word is that I come to you humbly as a supplicant and an outsider, presumptuously evaluating, describing, and judging your faith tradition, probably not doing it very well. So I ask for your forgiveness and forbearance on that score. And here's what I'm really trying to say, which is that for the good of our country, and maybe also the good of your faith, I'm not requesting that Christians be more liberal or conservative or secular or ecumenical or Republican or Democratic. I'm not asking for any of those things. I am asking that Christians highlight and bring forward those core elements of their own teaching which can help to heal our country and maybe your faith. I'm asking Christians to be more Christian, not less Christian, because I think people like me, need your help.
Amen to that. I cannot add any really helpful word other than a coda of "may it be so." And John, thank you so much for the work you are doing to help restore this load-bearing wall. I'm so honored to be your friend and honored to be a partner in this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, listeners, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I want to remind you to follow us on Apple Podcasts. Please help other people find really helpful conversations like this one by leaving ratings and reviews wherever you listen to The Good Faith. And next week, I'll once again join you around the campfire.